Ladies and gentlemen, good morning if you are staying in Belgium, good evening if you are in China. There are names that are so well known that are belonging to our Belgian patrimonial. When you mention the name of James Ensor, Peter Bruegel, Hergé, you know them. You know also the name of Ferdinand Verbiest. Ferdinand Verbiest is a well-known name, but not so many people know really what he did, why was he so well-known, why is he so well-known in China, what did he bring to China. All this is something that most of the people do not know. And I'm very happy today to introduce Veerle de Vos. Veerle de Vos has written an impressive book, and I show you the cover here, an impressive book on the life of Ferdinand Verbiest, on his discoveries of China, on also why is Ferdinand Verbiest so actual, so present, because what he did in China, what his approach of China still can be full of inspiration for today, for people who are in touch with China, for decision makers at political level also. The life and action of Ferdinand Verbiest is definitely an inspiration. And Veerle de Vos has worked, and she told me, 5 years on this book, and I fully can understand because it's full of information, full of new information that we discover thanks to her. The book is published in Flemish language, in Dutch language, but I'm sure soon we will have an English translation, a Chinese translation, and I hope also for the French-speaking people, a French translation. Veerle de Vos is very well known, especially in Flanders, because she is not only writing a book on Ferdinand Verbiest, but she's a journalist. She's a journalist in the foreign newsroom of VRT. In the recent years, she has made numerous reports in Asia, in the UK, in Ireland. She's a regular guest in various current affairs programs on radio and TV. And she has been fascinated with China since the 90s. She has also lived and worked in Wuhan for 2 years as an English teacher at the local university. She already wrote a book before this one called A Moon Shines in Every River, together with a Chinese friend, very poetical title for the book. And as a journalist, she also reported on many events in China, Sichuan earthquake, Olympic Games, World Expo, and so on. And today she will tell us about her book. To mention also, Veerle was present during the visit of our Prime Minister De Croo in January in China, and she attended the inauguration of a room in our Belgian embassy in Beijing, a room called Ferdinand Verbiest. So, Veerle, I leave you the floor. We are here to listen to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's a great honor to be able to speak about such a fascinating topic to me, and I hope also to you. I think Ferdinand Verbiest is one of the most remarkable figures in our shared Belgian-Chinese past. He's someone who links our two cultures and histories together. And the reason that we should still talk about him today is that I think that his experiences in the 17th century in China are still relevant today and can maybe help us navigate the indispensable but sometimes rocky relationship between our two countries and even our two continents. So I hope the story of Ferdinand Verbiest, who's also known as Nan Huairen in China, still holds some lessons for us today. I will start sharing my screen now because I've prepared a little presentation with some pictures and some paintings that maybe, yeah, can evocate the 17th century a little better today. Okay. Right. Okay, so All Under Heaven is a Chinese title. Ferdinand Verbiest and the Discovery of China. Of course, Discovery of China is tongue-in-cheek. I hope everyone understands that China was already very present for many, many years before the first Europeans arrived there. Maybe I can tell you that there's two reasons why I wanted to write this book. It's one part is a fascination with the past, and I think when you hear about 17th century Europeans who entered a closed country like China that many years ago, I wanted to know why and how did this meeting take place. But I also have a fascination with present China, which I meet every day during my work. I think even this morning I wrote a news report on the start of the People's Congress in Beijing. So I'm also fascinated in what way the 17th century story of this important figure still is relevant today. So that's why I wrote this book. Yeah, this is a little animation which my son made. It's a book in Dutch. But I want to, maybe as Mr. De Wit has already told you, that I once lived in China in the 90s. I was a teacher at Wuhan Daxue, so Wuhan University, and I wrote a book about this period with a Chinese friend and colleague about the way China was changing then. Already then I was trying to understand how this country worked and where it came from. I want to talk a little about why I wrote this book about Ferdinand Verbiest and how it came, how I found all the material. And everything started, in fact, many years ago in 2009. And 2009 was a year over years of great China enthusiasm in Europe. China had had a very successful Olympics in 2008. And we had in Brussels in 2009 a very big event on China called Europalia China, with several very big exhibitions on Chinese culture and Chinese history. One of the exhibitions I visited in Beaux-Arts here in Brussels was called Son of Heaven and was about the history of all the Chinese dynasties. There was a lot of gold and paintings and yellow and silk, but one object called my attention, and this was this little drawing of a moon eclipse in the year, I think it was 1674. And you have someone who has drawn the different stages of a moon eclipse, and I think it was in the different provinces of China. And what took my attention was that the fact that there were 3 languages written on this document. You had, of course, Mandarin on the right, you had Manchu, the language of the Qing emperors, and on the right, which I can't see on my screen now, there was Latin, and in the Latin was written that this moon eclipse took place in Beijing and in the whole of China in 1674, and that it was Ferdinandus Verbiest, so a Belgian Jesuit, who had made this for the emperor. And this really drew my attention. So I remember standing in front of the wall and seeing this drawing. And it also, I recalled something else I had seen in Beijing many years before in the 90s when I first arrived in China. And that was this building. It's the old astronomy tower in Beijing, in the old city wall, with these very old 16th and 17th astronomical objects on top. And I think everyone who knows Beijing and drives over, I think it's the 3rd ring road, passes this tower and you can still see these instruments on top. And I remember in the 90s when I was driving past this, I had a friend with me in a taxi, and she said, you know, this is a place where many famous Europeans worked, and also someone from your country called Nan Huairen. And it was in 2009 when I saw the drawing that I just showed you. that I clicked the two together, and I thought, this is the person my friend talked about who worked in the old astronomy tower. And while I was standing at this exposition in Brussels, there was a friend standing next to me, and he said, someone should write a book about this person. And this idea stuck in my head, and that's why today we have this book on Ferdinand Verbiest or mandarin. I will talk a little bit about the writing process because it took a long time. But yeah, then this is on the old drawing of the astronomy tower as it was during Verbiest's time. So you can see that not much has changed. And actually, it was him who, I think he drew or he made several, not all of them, but 4 or 5 of these instruments. A very nice mixture of Western science in the 17th century, European science, but also the aesthetics of China. So already you see that the way he worked, he really mingled the two cultures together from the start. So what did I do to write this book? First of all, I consulted a lot of books already written by eminent scientists who have done a lot of research on this period, who translated several letters and documents. A lot of documents are in Latin because that was the lingua franca of the Jesuits in Europe, the scientific language of that time, but also documents in Mandarin and documents in Manchu, which of course are hard for me to read. So I used a lot of work that scientists before me already did. But then I also tried to find some original documents. And this, for example, is a letter that Ferdinandus Verbiest, so he Latinized his first name, wrote when he was still very young. And he wrote to Rome to ask to leave for a mission, to become a missionary in Latin America, because that was his first dream. He wanted to travel to South America to become a missionary there. This is one of the original letters that I consulted in Rome, but I also did some research in Beijing, in the National Library, where you have one part which is devoted to rare manuscripts, and where they hold actually the library that these Western Jesuits had in Beijing. So these were 16th, 17th century books that Verbiest used while he was working for the emperor. So that's what I did. I traveled a little bit in the traces of Verbiest to find as many as possible original documents. I started at the place where he was born, which is Pittem in West Flanders, a small village where they erected a statue of him in front of the church. And he's looking at the place where he used to live. His original house of birth is already long gone. They're building new flats now at that point, and they're called Ferdinand Verbiest residence. So in his hometown, people still very much know who he was. I told you that I traveled in the traces of Verbiest. So I started in his place of birth, and I ended this famous place in Beijing. It's the Jialan Cemetery, and it's placed behind the Communist Party Education Center or school. As you can see, there are many graves of Jesuits, and one of the most beautiful ones is that of Ferdinand Verbiest, and he's buried next to Matteo Ricci, Li Ma Dao, also very well known in China, and Adam Schalvon-Biest, which was a German Jesuit and astronomer who worked in Beijing before. And I met one researcher, I think she's also a teacher at the school, who had done a lot of research on this cemetery. And I was lucky enough to visit this just before COVID. So at the end of 2019, it was already winter. I was able to visit the cemetery and do some research in Beijing. A month later, China closed for more than 3 years. So I was very lucky that I was still able to do this. So what did I found? Well, some of the first basic facts on Ferdinand Verbiest. This is a photograph in his youth. I think he was 25 when he first wanted to leave for South America. So he was born in a very little village in West Flanders, countryside, still countryside today, as a son of a, yeah, you could say he was a functionary in, so he was, let's say, upper middle class at that point in the 17th century. He was well educated. He went to the colleges of the Jesuits in Bruges and Courtrai. For a short time, he was a student at the KU Leuven University, but then he decided to end his studies there and become a novice for the Jesuits. The Jesuits were at that point a very successful religious order. Belgium, the part of Belgium where he lived, had once been converted, or a part of the people had been converted to Protestantism, to Calvinism, Reformation. But as the Spanish troops conquered these areas again, people returned to Catholicism, and the Jesuit order was a very important order to promote Catholicism again in Flanders and in Belgium. Yeah, I'm going a bit quick. After that, he became a teacher in Courtrai, in West of Flanders, but also in Brussels. He was in Brussels for 5 years. And then writing letters and letters again to Rome to ask his superiors to be able to become a missionary in South America. He left for his studies, theological studies in Rome, and then in Sevilla, already in Spain, hoping that he could once take a boat from there to South America. Something happened because he did not leave to South America. Luckily for us, he left for China in 1658. And he became, a couple of years later, an astronomer to the Kangxi Emperor. He became vice president of the Astronomy Bureau, also the observatory, as I just showed you. And he would work in Beijing for many, many years, so more than 25 years, until his death in Beijing in 1688. This is in a short way his life. Of course, there are many more things to tell, and I will go into a little detail. Not everything, because then I will be talking for more than 2 hours, which is not the point. So one of the things that struck me about Ferdinand Verbiest is actually summarized in these two pictures. On the left side, you see what was once the Koudenberg Palace in Brussels, one of the most famous European palaces, where the governors, the Spanish and Austrian governors who governed the southern Netherlands once lived. The Archduke, as we call them, had his seat. And of course, on the right side, you have the famous Forbidden City, the palace in Beijing. And what is special to Ferdinand Verbiest is that he was a teacher in both palaces. He was a teacher in Brussels to the children of not the Archduke, but all the nobles who worked at the court. He came there once a week to teach these children, but he was also a teacher in the Forbidden City. He was a teacher of the Kangxi Emperor. I don't think many people in the 17th century have combined these two jobs and have been at these two places. This is already something which is very special. There's something else I discovered while doing my research, which is that he was not alone. Actually, he was part of a group of friends, all people from the Netherlands, so people from Brussels, from the west of Flanders, from Maastricht, someone from Dunkirk, which is France nowadays. He had friends in Namur. And actually, there was a whole group of them who left for China together, which is really special, I think, because we're a very small place, and still we had many people leaving for China at that point, something which we here in Belgium have completely forgotten. Two of these very important people play a role in my book. Now, at the left side is actually an Italian Jesuit, and we think he's the reason why this came to China and not to South America, because in the middle of the 17th century, he'd already been in China. He had himself experienced the switch from the Ming Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty. He's written a novel about that, which became a bestseller. It was called The Tartar War, became an absolute bestseller in Europe, was translated into all sorts of languages. He also published one of the first atlas of China, so with maps of all Chinese provinces, an atlas that was published in Amsterdam. And then he came to Europe to do these things, to publish these books, but also to find new young recruits for the Chinese mission. He knew that in Flanders and in Belgium, he could find many young people who would be willing to go. So he went to all these colleges in Brussels, in Louvain, to find young people, to talk about China in a very enthusiastic way. He even had what we call a magic lantern with him, which was a new invention with glass plates, so he could project images of China on the wall. And he would say, you know, in China, there's a big harvest on the fields, but we have not enough harvesters to yield in this harvest. He drew a very positive image of China already. So he talked about a very high level civilization, maybe even superior to Europe, which was really yeah, a magical place, something we in Europe had never seen. And with this enthusiasm, he was able to, yeah, get a lot of recruits in Flanders. And one of them was actually the best friend of Verbiest, Philippe Couplet, same age as Verbiest. They had met as 18-year-old boys. And we think that Philippe or one of the other friends of Verbiest wrote a letter to Ferdinand, who was at that point studying in Sevilla in Spain, still waiting to leave to South America, and said, please, you have to come to China with us. We've heard about this magical place. They're looking for a lot of young people like us. Come with us. And so that's when Verbiest changed his mind and asked permission to leave for China and left for China. So that's how everything changed. Now, a trip to China in the mid-17th century was not a flight with Hainan Airlines from Brussels to Beijing. It was a bit harder at that point. You had to take a ship. You had to take a ship from Lisbon in Portugal, because that's where all the Jesuits leaving for Asia, leaving for China, would leave. They had to take a ship there, which would take them around Africa, Cape Good Hope. Sometimes they stopped along the way in Mozambique, which was also part of the Portuguese Empire, for fresh water and food. And then they continued all the way to Goa in India, which was also part of the Portuguese Empire. And they would have a stop there, they would rest, because it would have been a very hard trip. And then they would continue from Goa to Macau. As you see, it was quite complicated. They had to take a boat all around what was today Indonesia. And the reason is that the Dutch, who were at that point becoming very powerful maritime power in Asia, blocked certain ways. So the Jesuits, the Portuguese ships, had to make a big detour to reach Macau. I can tell you it was a very hard trip. So it was several months, usually more than a year before they reached the end of their destination. It was a very dangerous trip. And if you read about this trip, I think you can write a Netflix series about it, because of course, he was pirated. He was taken hostage by pirates on the way. His ship was shipwrecked several times, but he ended up arriving in Macau alive, unlike most of the other young people he left with. So I think they left with 14 young Jesuits and only 5 arrived alive. So it was a very deadly, a very dangerous trip, and you needed some courage or a very strong conviction to take this trip. So anyway, he arrived in Macau. Macau at that point was the only part of China where foreigners were allowed. So I should stress this as well, which is a very important fact. The whole of the Chinese Empire was closed to foreigners. No foreigners allowed. There were already Dutch commercial ships, English, the Russians. They all wanted access to this very rich empire and wanted access to the harbors, but they were not allowed. The only people, Western people, who were getting into China at that point were Jesuits, so a religious order. They were able to travel into China, and not only China, but to Beijing and actually into the Forbidden City. Why? I will try to explain a little bit later. So when Verbiest arrived in Macau, it was not really property, but the Portuguese were allowed to settle there and to have a little bit of, they could have some commerce in the harbor, they could have ships there. But at the left point, well, you can't see it at this map, of course, Macau was connected to China, and there was a very big gate, which was usually closed, which means that the Chinese could control Macau. They could close off this small little island completely if they wanted to. So you could not say it was a Portuguese colony. It was not Hong Kong later. It was still very much part of the Chinese Empire, but they were allowed to have some activities and to settle there. One of the things they built there was an enormous, beautiful Baroque church, I think the biggest one in Asia, which you can still visit today. Well, only the facade, because the rest of the church burned down. And also here you can see the mixture of Western cultural elements and sculptures with Chinese and with Chinese characters. So again, you see this very nice mixture of both cultures. When Verbiest arrived, and his friends, because also Philippe Couplet made it to China, to Macau, the first thing, they did, except for resting, because they had a very big college as well around this church, was studying. They started studying Chinese, and not only ni hao and ni chulama and very things we learn today. No, they studied classical Chinese. They started reading all the Chinese classics, the the Book of Odes, the Book of Changes, all the classic works of Confucius. Before they set one foot into China, they made sure that they knew what China was, how it was governed, they knew the history of China, because a very strong conviction of the Jesuit order, which Verbiest was part of, was that you can achieve nothing in China if you don't understand the language, if you don't understand the culture, and if you don't understand the history. Something I think we today in the West have a little bit forgotten. But that was a very strong conviction. So once they entered China, and once Verbiest was able to enter China, he knew something about China. He was not just tourists entering there. Another thing which the Jesuits learned, or the Europeans learned once they were in Macau, was the Chinese worldview, which was a little bit different from the world they grew up in. They learned that the emperor, Tianzi, the son of heaven, was the middle of this Chinese emperor in the Forbidden City, that around that you had the Chinese population, then you had what was called the outer subjects, so people belonging to minorities, for example, and then the tributary states, which at that point were states like Japan and Vietnam and Thailand and so on, and Korea, etc. It was a very strong conviction of the Chinese that everyone who got into contact with this Chinese civilization would adapt and would take parts of this culture, made it their own, which is actually what happened, because if you look at places like Korea and Japan and Vietnam, at a certain point, they all use the Chinese characters. They still have, many of these countries still have the Confucian convictions, many other things. Of course, the Europeans, they were considered barbarians, completely at the top left side of this whole worldview. We did not come into contact with China, so we could not be influenced by this culture. This is one of the things they learned. These are some images which I sometimes show when I talk about this. For people who are not familiar with these ideas, you have, of course, the famous Temple of Heaven, round as heaven is, and then the square around it for the earth, where the emperor went once a year to pray and to make contact with heaven, this very important heaven, and pray for good harvest and good luck. And the Tian Sha concept, all under heaven, which is, of course, very important. When the Jesuits first came, or Europeans first came to China, they brought with them science. So I already talked about the fact that they were the only ones to enter China. What was the key that they had to enter 16th, 17th century China was Western science. At that point, I have to stress, at that point in history, Western European science was more advanced than Chinese science. We had in the West at that point the beginning of the whole scientific revolution with very important scientists. And for example, our geographic maps at that point were maybe a little more accurate than Chinese maps, the same for astronomy, geography, etc. So the Jesuits came to China with these maps to tell them Chinese how the world looked. Very soon they understood that they had to change it a little bit, and they drew their maps like this. It's not very clear, but what should be clear to everyone is that China is in the middle. So they adapted their worldview to the Chinese worldview, and Europe, so central to us, was again delegated or directed to the upper left corner of the earth, and China was in the middle. So they transformed their science, but they were very well aware of the Chinese point of view, and they adapted to this Chinese point of view, which is very interesting. And again, I think a difference with how we work today. When Verbiest came eventually to Beijing, which is a couple of years later, of course, he also met several important people, which would play a very big role in his life. And on the right side, you have the young Kangxi Emperor. It's a portrait of the emperor, I think, as how Verbiest has known him, because of course there was an age difference. Verbiest was older, the Kangxi Emperor was still very young. Another important figure in his life was the Empress, Empress Xiao Zhuang, the grandmother of the Emperor, Kangxi Emperor. She played a very important role. And also then again, we have to go to a Netflix series, because at a certain point, of which I will not talk about too much today, Verbiest and his fellow Jesuits are in prison. They're about to be executed. And at that point, well, heaven shows that it's not very satisfied with the situation. There's a big storm, there's an earthquake, but it's the grandmother of Kangxi who will stop this execution and say, you have to leave these people. They're too important. They have also helped my son. So her son, they're important to his grandson. And so the fate of these Jesuits, of this, is also very well connected with the grandmother. I think a very famous grandmother of the Kangxi Emperor. Verbiest then at a certain point becomes astronomer for the emperor in Forbidden City. It doesn't happen just like that, because there is a very important struggle at the court, which I think is also still relevant if we look today. It's not normal for a lot of Chinese, for a lot of mandarins. It's not very normal that the science of heaven, which is such an important concept in Chinese culture, is given into the hands of foreigners. So actually, by making foreigners like the director of the Astronomic Bureau and responsible for calendar making, for how to say, interpreting the signs of heaven, give that into the hands of foreigners is not natural, is not logical. And so there's a big struggle at a certain point in the court, and it will come back again and again. Though, is it good to give these foreigners so much influence? Don't we let ourselves? Can we let ourselves be influenced by Western cultures in that amount? And you see very much this way between opening up Chinese civilizations for foreign influences and then closing off again. You always have these two, how to say, waves at the court of Chinese who say, no, it's important, the science is important for us, we can use it. And you will have other people at the court who say it's too dangerous. The Chinese heaven is something that only we Chinese should interpret. So what will happen at a certain point is that the emperor, the young emperor, who's very interested in sciences and very interested in this Western science, he will say, look, we will have a competition to decide who's the most competent astronomer. We will have the Chinese astronomers and the Westerners, which at that point is the young Verbiest, who has just arrived in Beijing, and have a competition. And one of the competitions will take place here in the Forbidden City. This is actually a picture from January when I was in Beijing with Prime Minister De Croo, and especially for this visit, they emptied the Forbidden City for half an hour, as they usually do. Usually it's not that empty, but for me, I could imagine this is the way that Verbiest probably saw it very often when he was there. So the emperor will have a sundial installed in the middle of one of these big squares in the Forbidden City, and he will ask Verbiest, and he will ask his Chinese counterpart, his competitor. They have to draw a line on the sundial to show where the next day at 12 o'clock at noon the shadow of the sun will be. So that's the first part of the competition. Verbiest will do that, and at the day when the competition happens, you have to imagine I think one of the drawings from before, where you have all sorts of mandarins standing in a big circle around the sundial. You have Verbiest, you have the Chinese astronomers waiting for the sun to reach the point at noon. And Verbiest says, yeah, of course, he was very nervous that the shadow was very, very slowly crept on the sundial. He said, my enemies were already laughing sarcastically and saying, he will be wrong. It's not, the line is not at the right spot. But with the help of God, he writes in his letters, exactly at 12 o'clock at noon, the shadow is exactly at the line that Verbiest has drawn. So he wins this competition. There will be, of course, it's not finished yet. There will be several other stages. One of them will happen at night in the old astronomy tower, where again, they have to tell the audience at a certain point at night where certain stars will be on the heavens. Again, Verbiest wins this competition, and the young emperor will against all the opposition at the court, will make him the head of the astronomy bureau, and from that point on he will have a very important job and a very important influence on this young emperor. What will Verbiest do? One of the things he will do is draw up the calendar, so that's a very important task, of course. The calendar, Verbiest writes in his letters, the most important book published in the whole of China and outside the borders, because it's also used in these tribute states around China as a very important book. It has all the sun eclipses or moon eclipses are in it, but also positive days, negative days, sun up, sun down, etc. And Verbiest will be the main responsible person to draw up this calendar every year, which is of course a very, very important job to perform in China. We will also draw some new astronomical instruments, the ones that are still, you can still see today at the top of the astronomy tower, where he uses new Western science and he mingles it with Chinese aesthetics. And you see the dragon here, I think it's an azimuth or one of the other astronomical instruments which they use, and you have the very beautiful dragon, which is of course made by Chinese craftsmen in Beijing at that point. It doesn't stop there. The emperor will also use Verbiest as an engineer, because actually Verbiest is a very smart mathematician, but he also has very good engineering skills. He will use him, for example, when there's a bridge which is not very stable in the neighborhood of Beijing, and Verbiest has to try to repair it. Irrigation of the rice fields of the emperor, again, Verbiest will be called to help. And one of the very important jobs which he will also perform is cannons. So at a certain point, the Kangxi emperor gets a lot of opposition from the south of China. You have the three lords who belong to the Han population, who come, let's say, start a war against this new Qin dynasty, and Verbiest will devise cannons for the emperor to help him conquer these enemies. The Kangxi emperor will succeed, and he will conquer the south of China. And again, we have someone, Verbiest, a Belgian from the Belgian countryside, who will actually have played a very big role in this. Verbiest was a priest. Devising cannons was maybe not, but anyway, he asked permission for this, and he always said, I do this for the mission in China, which I will talk about a bit later. What else did he do? He became a private teacher to the Chinese emperor. As I already told you, the emperor was very interested in sciences, very interested in Western science, in all sorts of science. And he asked Verbiest at a certain point, can you come and teach me? Bring all the books you have. I want to learn about Western mathematics. I want to learn about geography. I want to learn about astronomy. And so Verbiest will visit the emperor in his private quarters, which is important because the public, as you all know, in the Forbidden City, you have two parts. You have an outer part, Wai, Hu, and you have Nei, the inner part. Of course, the very few visitors or foreign visitors who came into the Forbidden City could only visit the public part with the big halls when you enter the city. But Verbiest was one of the very few Westerners who was allowed in the inside quarters to teach the emperor in his private library, and he could eat with him. He was often asked to stay for lunch, so he had a very close relationship with this young emperor. And then the last drawing is one, if you Google Verbiest in English and you Google first car and you Google Verbiest's name, you get this drawing. Verbiest is also known as the inventor of the first automobile. It's actually a little car, I think it was made of wood, which was moved by steam. There was water in the big bowl. There was a fire beneath. The steam could leave and then would turn all the wheels around. Verbiest devised this as a play, as a toy for the sons of the emperor, which was another thing the Jesuits did. They devised a lot of toys and musical instruments, mechanical nightingales who would sing. If you think about the fairy tale, I think this is the origin of that fairy tale, and also these cars. And it was so successful that also the brothers of the emperor would ask Verbiest to devise these sort of cars for their kids. And this little car also You should imagine the picture I showed you of the Forbidden City. It would drive around in one of these big squares to amuse the princess. So this is what Verbiest did. He had such a heavy schedule that he would have to write letters to his superior in Rome to ask if he could skip his prayers because he didn't have any time left. Nan Huairen, as his Chinese name was, had all these jobs. He combined all these jobs, which I think is quite impressive. I think I talked about most of them. At a certain point, he became a vice minister in the Chinese government of public works, which is, of course, what he also did. But he was also an interpreter and a translator at the court. I just said at that point, you had several foreign embassies who tried to enter China. The Dutch would send embassies, the English, the Russians, and often Verbiest would be asked to translate because, of course, he did speak Dutch, he spoke Latin, he spoke Chinese, he spoke Manchu. And for example, when the first Russian embassy arrives in Beijing, Verbiest will be asked to translate and the negotiations will be in Latin because the Russian envoy also speaks Latin, Verbiest speaks Latin. So the Chinese government will say, we will conduct these negotiations in Latin and then translate into Chinese. He was also a travel companion, and some of the most interesting letters that Verbiest has written and that are also in the book are about his trips with the Kangxi Emperor to his birth ground. So of course the Qing emperors came from Manchuria, and once every year in summer they traveled back to their place of origin to worship some of the mountains, to worship the rivers. It was a huge trip with thousands of people. There was even a special road was made, mountains were moved, things that Chinese engineers are still very good at today. I think they already did then, especially for this trip of the emperor. And the emperor asked Verbiest to accompany him, so that at night when they would stay in tents, because the Manchus originally were nomads, they would all stay in tents with part of the army presence. They would have big, they would have several excursions during these trips. But at night they would sit under the heavens, under the stars, and then the emperor would ask Verbiest to come and sit next to him and explain the stars to him. And then the emperor would also show how much he had learned from Verbiest. So I think, as you can see, it was a very rare, very close relationship between, I think, a Chinese emperor and a Western Jesuit at that point. Of course, as I said, Verbiest was 20 years or more older than the emperor, and the emperor always regarded him as a wise teacher, which still today is very important in China, I think, this concept of a teacher, of an older teacher. Let's see, I think, yeah. As I just told you, Verbiest didn't have time to pray or convert Chinese, which was the reason why he originally arrived in China. But his friends did. As I told you about Philippe Couplet and some other Belgians who were there at that point, they were allowed to do some conversion. And I have three Chinese, which I want to talk a little bit about because they're very interesting people that did get converted to Catholicism at that time. I should mention Catholicism, Christian religion, was forbidden in China at that point. It was a foreign religion, it was a forbidden religion. But what happened was, because Verbiest had such good relations with the emperor for all the work he did, he had such good guanxi that the emperor allowed Verbiest's friends to do some converting. So that was the deal. Catholicism could exist. The Jesuits, which were at that point never more than 20, so it's not that you had thousands of them already in China. It was at most 20 men who were present, especially around Shanghai and Hangzhou, but also in the south. They built some churches. Some churches are still there today in China, and they could convert some people. I should mention that during the Ming Dynasty, the previous dynasty, the Jesuits were able to convert some very high mandarins and even ministers in the Chinese government. During the Qing dynasty, this does not happen anymore. If you work for the emperor, if you work in the Qing government, you better not convert to Catholicism. That was a lesson that they had learned. I already talked a little bit about what happened to the Jesuits who were at a certain point in prison. So it had to do with that, and also with some opposition at the court. Still, that these foreigners had too much influence. Anyway, the Friends of Verbiest were able to convert some very interesting people. One of them is Wu Li, which is I think still today a Qing poet, but also a calligrapher, a painter. I think he's part of the early Qing painters. He's someone who at a certain point converted to Catholicism, even traveled to Macau and became a Jesuit priest. Very important to stress is that he still called himself a Confucianist. So there was no contradiction. It's not because these people converted to Catholicism that they lost all their Chinese culture. The Jesuits thought it was very important that you could combine the two. When they converted Chinese, they said these people should be allowed to still have a Confucian altar and pay homage to their ancestors. Mass or the Bible text should be in Chinese. So they were very open-minded. They thought you can practice parts of your Chinese culture and Confucianism, and at the same time be Catholic. That was very important. That was really the way how they saw how it should happen. So Wu Li was one of these people who converted. This is also very interesting. It's a woman, because for women it was a little easier to convert to Catholicism than for men. Most men, especially if they were mandarins, had several wives, and of course, according to Catholicism, you can only have one wife. So for the men, it was not possible, but the wives were allowed to convert because they only had one man. This is someone, Candida Xu. We don't know her Chinese first name. We only know her Western name, because it was Philippe Couplet, the friend of Verbiest, who wrote a little biography about her. She's actually someone who will support the Jesuit mission in China financially. At a certain point, she becomes a widow, and then she has her own money. She has a business she lived in Shanghai or Songjian at that part. So her family was busy with textiles, with needlework. She would sell the needlework, invest the money, and use some of her own money to support the Jesuits. So I thought it was very interesting that a Chinese woman from the higher class, who at that point lived a very secluded life behind closed doors, did not come into contact with men, were still able to convert, use their own money and support this cause, pay for artworks, pay for churches to be built. So I thought it was very interesting. And then the last one, I think, is maybe the most interesting figure, is Shen Fuzong. He's someone who comes from a Catholic family, who's already converted several generations ago, so from the 16th century. And at a certain point, Ferdinand Verbiest will send his best friend, Philippe Couplet, back to Europe for the same reason that these Italian Jesuits went to Europe, to collect money, to collect funds, to collect support for the Chinese mission, to find new young people to come to China and to defend their cause, to show the success they have in China. They will bring a Chinese convert. And Shen Fuzong is a very young Chinese who actually studies Latin to go to Europe, and he will travel to Europe. I think a Chinese author should write a book about him, because it's a fascinating life story. He gets to see all of Europe, not only Flanders and Belgium and Amsterdam. He even travels to Versailles in Paris. He meets the French king, Louis XIV. He shows Louis XIV how you should eat with chopsticks. For example, he visits the gardens at Versailles. He also visits the English king, who's at that point a Catholic king, James I. And James I is so in full admiration for this young Chinese who speaks Latin and who is very civilized, that he asks his court painter, his own painter, to paint this portrait of Shen Fuzong. And this painting today is still, it's still a property of the British royal family. I think it's in Windsor Castle, and it was close to the bedroom of the former queen, is the place where it still hangs today. So I think a very interesting figure. So that's what the Friends of Verbiest will do while he is working at the court. It's not the only thing. There's something else they do. As I told you in the beginning, so the Western Jesuits bring Western science, but there is an exchange because these Jesuits, very well-educated people, will find a lot of things very interesting in China, which they will bring to Europe. So it's really a two-way exchange, which I think is very important and a very big difference with the 200 years that will come after that. What sparks their interest is Chinese medicine, for example. This is one of the drawings which Western scientists will copy from Chinese works. So the Jesuits will translate these Chinese works into Latin. Chinese at that point take the pulse. In the West, we have never heard of it. We still use all other sorts of medieval ways to treat people. So the Jesuits see this, they learn about this, and they say, this is actually interesting, we could use this. So they will translate these Chinese scientific medicine works into Latin, and they will transfer this knowledge. They will also, of course, write about all the specific flora and fauna that they find in China, especially herbs and roots and plants that are come from Chinese traditional medicine and that are beneficial to health. And a lot of these products, they will come to Europe and they will write about this in books, why people should also use this in Europe. And then the third very important thing they will do is translate, as I think the first Westerners, Chinese philosophy. So they're very interested in Confucianism. They're very interested in Confucius. As I already told you, they think the two can exist perfectly together, Catholic religion and Confucianism. And they will be the first ones to translate Confucius into Latin and publish it in Europe. And so Philippe Couplet, his best friend, will take this whole manuscript where several people from Belgium have worked on, translated, I think, the first 4 books of the works of Confucius, and they will publish it in in Latin. They will publish it in Paris. Very important, they translated it in Latin, but they wanted to add Chinese characters because they thought it was very important. If you really wanted to understand the philosophy, you should also know some Chinese characters. And they had in the manuscript left places for these characters. But in the end, the printer in Paris thought it was too complicated and too expensive to put these characters in the first translation, so they were left out. But just to mention and to show how well they understood these texts and how well they understood the whole Chinese worldview. So I think I'm coming very slowly to the end of my story today. Of course, in the book, there's much more of it all. This period will end. So I think the period of these Jesuits in China started in the late 16th century with Matteo Ricci and who came to China. It will end 200 years later when all the Jesuits will be expelled from China. Very important to stress is it was not the emperor who made an end at this very fruitful period, I think. It was Europe, it was Rome. So at a certain point, the opposition from Rome grows. You have other Catholic orders who come to China and they will say, you know what these Jesuit people are doing, what Verbiest and his friends are doing, that's not really conversion. If you convert foreign people to a Western religion, they should leave out all their own culture and they should only use these Catholic ceremonies and Catholic aspects of life. They cannot no longer pay homage to ancestors, they can no longer pay homage to Confucianism, etc. Rome will demand of the Jesuits to change all this. They will also want someone in China to make sure that they obey this. Of course, the Jesuits don't want this. At that point, the Chinese emperor, I think, who's the grandson or the son or grandson of Kangxi Emperor, will say, sorry, if this is the way you want to convert people, it's finished. And that will be the end of these 200 years of what I would call the first win-win cooperation between the West and East, where you genuinely have an interest in each other's ideas, in each other's culture, and where there's actually an exchange of both views. That's far more or less where I want to end this conversation with. Yes, there's something else I want to say as well. And I think it's very important, the lesson, after writing this book for 5 years, what I've started to realize is how much we have changed in the West compared to my ancestors 2 years ago. Of course, after these 200 years of very fruitful cooperation, a new era starts, and then you have the British and the other Western powers who will no longer ask the emperor if they can enter China. They will actually use violence. They would use opium, to break open China. And at that point, there's no longer a really exchange of ideas or an equality between the two. And then you have China's age of humiliation, etc., etc. I think what we inherited from that later period is our idea in the West, which I think we still have today, that we are in some way superior. When we go to China still today, or when many people think about China today, they still think, oh, China will become like us. China will become like Europe or America. They will inherit all our values, and they will slowly but surely they will change and become more like us. I think it's very important to realize that that's not what the Jesuits thought 200 years ago. When Verbiest was in China, he understood very well this is a different civilization. We will never be able to change China or make it as we are. We will be able to exchange certain knowledge and certain ideas and make each other better, but we will not change China. And I think that's a very important lesson for today. One of the most important lessons I think this book has for everyone, I think, that we might get some inspiration in the way they looked at China or the way the exchange at that period went. There's two lines I want to end with today, and they're two quotes of President Xi. He visited Belgium 10 years ago, in 2014, and at that point he also made a speech in Bruges at the College of Europe, very important college, and I think this is where I start my book with this visit, because I was, as a reporter, I had to run behind the delegation for 4 days. We also visited the pandas in Paradise, Chinese pandas, etc. But I also was present during the speech. One of the things, oh no, what did I do now? Let's see, something, yeah. Yeah, there were two things I said that struck me. No one can understand China today without understanding all aspects of its history. This is something the Jesuits, this is something Ferdinand Verbiest already understood 200 years ago. You cannot understand China if you don't know the history of China. And there was something else. History is not a linear movement. History repeats itself, which also means that if China was once a world power, which it was in the 17th century when Verbiest lived there, it will be a world power again. I think these are two very important messages, which link also, there's a link with my book. To conclude, I think there's just this one, yes, this was me in front of the cemetery, in front of the grave of Verbiest. I think his body is no longer there because we've had the Boxer Rebellion, another part of Chinese history. But afterwards, the grave and the stone, the steel was very well restored. It's still a very beautiful place today, a very magical place to walk, because there are tens and tens and tens of graves of young Europeans who came to China to work for the emperor in several several skills they used in China. At the same time, they were allowed to also to work in China at that point. It's this quote, and I think it's something to remember. It's one of the scientists who one of the books that was an inspiration for me. It's clear that the future relations between China and the West will have more in common with the ebb and flow of mutual influence between 1500 and 1800, and with the period of Western arrogance and humiliations of China between the years of 1800 and 2000. I think this is a conclusion to end this talk with today. As we said, the book at this point is only available in Dutch. Maybe that will change. But if there are any people who have any questions, I'm open to them.
Thank you very much, Veerle. Thank you for this brilliant expose and the fact that you clearly show us finally the parallel of the life and action of Verbiest in China in the 17th century and the inspiration we can get it for our today's approach to China. I think this is really of utmost interest. You have started by explaining about why you wrote this book, what inspired you in writing this book. You have also told us about the life of Verbiest first in Belgium and then this young Jesuit who wants to be a missionary in Latin America, then finally going to China, travel full of dangers. There were 14 to leave, only 5 arrived. These young Jesuits, full of energy, full of admiration for a country where they are arriving. The extraordinary life bringing him to be close to the emperor, having various functions. He's a mathematician, he's an astronomical scientist, he's a teacher, he's a translator, he's a diplomat in some way. This young guy of Piton made it so extraordinary. And what is also interesting is the approach the Jesuits had. And they were coming as missionary, but had they to go to forced conversion? Definitely not. That was not the philosophy of the Jesuits. But as always in human history, not everyone was agreeing with them within the Catholic Church in Rome, with opposition. The emperor himself had mandarins around him who were not so pleased with the approach of Jesuits like Verbiest. And in fact, we find that back in nowadays relationship within the Western countries, within China. There are also often opposition to the concept of trying to find bridges, to find a way of dialogue in a respectful way for each other, which was what Verbiest did. And you brilliantly showed us how we can take inspiration from his action, from his life in nowadays politics, in nowadays relations, and also for our businessmen in going to China. So now we have the possibility to ask some questions, and don't hesitate to do it through the chat. I was wondering, Veerle, you write this book. Do you think we'll have many Jesuits nowadays? I mean, the philosophy of the Jesuits approaching China, is it disappearing nowadays compared to several years ago? Are you optimistic, or do you see many negative factors both in the Western world and in China?
I think that, as I said before, we have a very different mindset. We don't really realize it, because often when I talk with friends about this, they say, no, that's not true. I say, yes, it is true. You still think the rest of the world in the end will all look like we are, and they will all, copy our systems, and they will become like us. So I think that's that's still present. At the same time, I do think more and more people, of course, realize that China is becoming a world power again, that we will have to reckon with and that we will have to learn to live with and deal with. It's indispensable. We can't, you have some people nowadays who want to turn back the clock and say, no, no, we shut off and we do our own thing in Europe and we try to disconnect from China. I think that's nonsense. I think that's impossible. It's not good for no one. At the same time, there is a worrying trend. I can speak for Europe. I'm not sure if the same happens in China, which is that there is less and less knowledge of Chinese culture. So if you talk to people in universities here in Belgium, they have less and less students of Chinese. Young people, they like Japanese and manga or Korea and K-pop, but for some reason they're not interested anymore to study Chinese. I think that's very dangerous because you need more than ever knowledge of each other. You need knowledge of the culture, of the history, something the Jesuits knew 200 years ago, to understand each other. We will have to deal with China more and more, not less and less. So we need more knowledge. I still think, and I write it at the end of my book, that in China there's more interest and more knowledge of Western culture, civilization, politics than the opposite. I think there's more specialists that study Western political systems and that try to know how does it work, how does Western democracy work, advantages, disadvantages. We don't really study the other. There's just not enough interest, I think, and I think that's very dangerous. I still think that a lot of Chinese intellectuals know more about Western culture or great writers and painters. We know so little about the Chinese culture. Tomorrow I will be in Ghent and I will interview a contemporary young Chinese writer, Zhang Yiren, very popular in China. No one has heard of her here. This is just, yeah, and I think that's a pity. And that shows that there's still this unequal relationship, which is not good, I think. So, yeah.
But thanks to you, we have now more links with the Chinese culture, definitely. And maybe we saw when you look at these last 40 years in the relationship with China, there have been ups and downs. And at some moments, our sinology departments were full of students.
Yep.
Now, as you say, we have a lack of students. We can hope that maybe in several years it comes back with these ups and downs. But I fully agree with you. It's so important to know each other better. And as you say, there are more centers in China looking at European culture than there are in Europe looking at Chinese culture. And I think books like yours are helping to bridge the gap between our two cultures. So Veerle, we are coming now to an end of our session. I wanted to thank you very much. I wanted to say again and invite again our listeners to buy your book, to look and read your book, which is so interesting. And I'm sure that translations will come and maybe a Netflix series about the life of Ferdinand Verbiest, inspired from your book. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.